She was 9 years old the first time a man in an office looked at her face and decided what it was worth. He worked at Universal, and he turned her down. And the reason he gave has survived 80 years. The child's eyes were too old. She did not have the face of a child. There was nothing in her. 2 years later, she had a 7-year contract at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, signed by her parents because she was 10 and could not sign it herself. America decided Elizabeth Taylor was the luckiest girl who ever lived. The violet eyes, the horses, the diamonds, the 2 Oscars, the 8 marriages, 79 years of being the most photographed woman alive. She was not lucky. She was manufactured, and everyone involved knew the cost, and they paid it with her body. Because her mother had been a working Broadway actress who was made to quit and never got off her daughter's film sets. Because the eyes that made her famous are, in medical terms, a mutation. Because the film that made her a star at 12 broke her back, and the pills started around the same time and did not stop for 40 years. Because her first wedding was paid for by her employer and timed to a film release, and the marriage was over in 8 months, and the man was violent. Because she married 8 times looking for one she had chosen herself. And because the moment America loved her most, genuinely, unanimously, tearfully, was the month she nearly died. They gave her an Oscar for it. She knew exactly what it was for, and she said so. It started with a mother who had already given it up. Sarah Viola Warmbrod of Arkansas City, Kansas, became an actress under the name Sarah Southern. Not a hopeful, a working one. She appeared on Broadway in the early 1920s in a play called The Fool, in a part that got her noticed, and she took it to London. She was on her way. Then in 1926, she married Francis Taylor, an art dealer, and she stopped. That was simply the arrangement. A woman with a career married, and the career ended. Hold on to Sarah. She is the engine of everything that follows, and neither of the easy versions of her is right. Sarah did not, by any account, resent the arrangement out loud. Women of her generation did not. But she had stood on a Broadway stage and been reviewed, and then she had spent a decade at gallery openings being introduced as somebody's wife, and there is no version of that trade that leaves nothing behind. Elizabeth was born in Hampstead, London, on February 27, 1932, and she was born with a mutation, distichiasis, a second row of eyelashes growing behind the first. It is a genuine genetic anomaly. It can irritate and damage the eye, and it produced the most commercially valuable pair of eyes of the 20th century. That is the founding fact of her life. What made her famous was not a talent she developed or a decision she made. It was a condition she was born with that a doctor would call a defect and an industry would call an asset. Her body was the product before she could speak. The family came to America in 1939, ahead of the war, and Frances opened a gallery, eventually inside the Beverly Hills Hotel. Think about that address. An art dealer there in 1940 was not selling to the public. He was selling to producers, executives, and stars in a building that functioned as the industry's living room. So the Taylors arrived in Los Angeles with an extraordinary-looking small daughter and a family business whose customer list was the men who bought faces. And Sarah went to work. Nobody disputes this, including Elizabeth. She cultivated the gallery's clientele and got the child in front of people. There are competing accounts of which connection produced the first screen test, and I wouldn't stake anything on the chain. The direction is not in question. A former actress who had been made to stop pushed a 9-year-old toward the thing she had lost. I want to be fair because stage mother is a lazy category. Sarah genuinely believed her daughter was exceptional, and she was right. But she was also resuming her own career through another body, and she never got off the set. That is literal. For years, Sarah Taylor stood on Elizabeth's film sets, behind the director where he could not easily see her, giving her daughter hand signals, telling her what to do with her face. Picture the working conditions. A child performs. In front of her is a man employed by the studio. Behind him is her mother, gesturing. Neither of those people is her, and both are telling her what to be. That's not a stage mother. That's a second director with a biological claim. MGM signed her in 1942. The contract was standard and it was ownership. A modest weekly wage, options renewable at the company's discretion and not hers. The right to loan her to other studios at a profit the studio kept. Suspension without pay for refusing a part and a morals clause. She could not work anywhere else. Her parents signed it because she was 10. Lassie Come Home worked in 1943. A small uncredited part in Jane Eyre followed, playing a girl who dies. And then, in 1944, National Velvet. MGM had bought her from Universal's discard pile, effectively, and then spent 2 years working out what she was for. The answer arrived with a horse. She wanted it, and how she got it is the first evidence of the will that later terrified studio heads. She was too small. The account she gave for the rest of her life is that she was told to come back when she was bigger. And she went away and grew 3 inches in a matter of months and came back and got it. The version she preferred and told most often is that she did it deliberately, riding, eating, stretching, willing herself upward because the part was going to be hers. Take the 3 inches as recollection rather than record. The shape is not in doubt. A 12-year-old was told her body was insufficient for employment and set about modifying it, and it worked, and that lesson went in early and never came out. National Velvet was enormous. It made her a star at 12, and during production, it did the thing that shaped every remaining year of her life. She fell from the horse and injured her back. That is the center of this story. It happens on the film that made her famous, and almost every telling treats it as a footnote before hurrying on to the husbands. Do not hurry on. From 12, she was in chronic pain. Over the following decades, she underwent dozens of operations, including repeated spinal surgery. She was hospitalized so often, it became a running joke in the American press. A joke told about a woman whose spine was damaged at 12 on a studio's horse, on a studio's schedule, for a studio's picture. And here is what follows from it, stated plainly and without glamour, because the papers of her era treated it as entertainment, and it was not. A person in chronic pain from adolescence, inside a system that needs her on set tomorrow, gets given things. Taylor spoke openly in later life about being given sleeping pills as a child performer, and about a dependence on prescription medication that ran for decades and eventually took her to the Betty Ford Center in the 1980s. She hid none of it. The pain started at 12. So did the pills. Everything downstream, the hospitalizations, the near death in 1961, 40 years of dependence, traces to a fall on a set in 1944. That's not a personal weakness. That's an industrial injury to a child, followed by 4 decades of managing it. And notice what the studio did with it, because this is where the ordinary cruelty of the arrangement shows. There was no compensation, no adjustment to her schedule, and no acknowledgement of any kind. She was 12 and under contract, and a contract player in pain is a scheduling obstacle rather than a patient. The pictures continued. The loan-outs continued. The publicity built around her as a horse-loving outdoor girl continued, and she went on being photographed on horseback for years by a company that knew precisely what a horse had already done to her spine. Now the machine that held her, because this is the part that sounds benign and was not, Californian law required child performers to be educated. So MGM ran a schoolhouse on the lot, and the pupils were the studio's other juvenile assets. 3 hours a day, in 20-minute fragments, in whatever gaps the shooting schedule left. Consider what that produces. No classmates who were not colleagues. No teacher who was not an employee of her employer. No walk home, no unsupervised hour, no friendship that wasn't observed, and no arena in her entire adolescence, where she was not being assessed by someone with a commercial interest in the result. When she said later she never had a childhood, she was not being self-pitying. She was describing a timetable. And the children in that building talked, and several of them were being destroyed. Judy Garland had come through the same system a few years ahead of her. What studio doctors handed out to keep young performers thin, then awake, then asleep, was not a rumor inside those walls. It was the working conditions. So Elizabeth Taylor grew up watching, at close range, precisely what this industry did to girls who were useful to it. That was the real education on that lot. And here is the thing that makes all of it stranger, and that the title of this story depends on. Everybody loved her, not the studio, the country. By 13, she was receiving fan mail in volumes MGM, measured by weight. Girls wrote asking how to get eyelashes like hers. There were Elizabeth Taylor paper dolls, coloring books, a horse-riding craze that National Velvet set off across America, and a book published under her name in 1946 when she was 14, about her pet chipmunk, with her own illustrations in it. She was, from 12 onward, one of the most adored people in the United States. And every single hour of the life that adoration was based on was scheduled by a corporation, conducted in pain, and described in words she did not write. That is the cruelty this story is actually about. Not neglect, not hatred. Adoration, arriving in enormous quantities, aimed at a manufactured version of a child who was in a great deal of trouble underneath it, from people who would have been horrified if they had known and who were never going to be told. Outside the schoolhouse, the studio decided what she ate, what she wore, who photographed her, what she said in interviews, and who she was seen with. Dates were arranged. Statements were issued in her name. From 9 to 18, she was a person whose public existence was drafted by other people. There is one moment from those years that tells you what was underneath it, and it involves Louis B. Mayer. The story, which she told consistently for 60 years, is that Mayer summoned her and Sarah and became abusive, swearing at her mother, telling them in the crudest terms that they were nothing, that he had made her. And the teenage Elizabeth Taylor stood up in the office of the most powerful man in American film, told him he and his studio could go to hell, walked out, and never entered that room again. It improved slightly in the telling. Something like it happened. And here is why it matters. Every other person in that building was frightened of that man, and she was not. That's not courage exactly. That's a person who was never given ordinary childhood deference, and therefore never learned to perform it. If this is landing, subscribe, because the next part is the wedding, and the wedding was a line item. She met Conrad Nicholson Hilton Jr., Nicky, at the Mocambo in October 1949. He was 24, heir to the hotel fortune, charming, and a fixture of the nightclub circuit. She was 17. The engagement was announced in February 1950. At exactly the same time, she was shooting Father of the Bride for Vincente Minnelli, playing a young woman getting married, opposite Spencer Tracy. The studio saw what it had, and it did not hesitate. MGM paid for the wedding. The gown was a gift from the studio, 25 yards of ivory silk satin, bugle beads and seed pearls, a bodice corseted to a 20-inch waist, built by 15 seamstresses over roughly 3 months, designed by Helen Rose, MGM's head of costume. Rose had just designed the wedding dress Taylor wears in the film, and the studio had the two made to resemble each other. The guest list was managed. The photographs were arranged. She married on May 6, 1950, at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills, a few blocks from the house she grew up in. 600 guests inside, thousands in the street, and a crowd that had to be held back by police. The film premiered 12 days later, with the marriage worked directly into the campaign. It cost $1,215,000 and took over $6 million. Read that as a sequence of business decisions, because that is what it was. A company noticed its 18-year-old contract player was marrying in the same season as a picture in which she plays a bride. It funded the real wedding, dressed the real bride to match the fictional one, scheduled the release 12 days after the ceremony, and pointed its entire publicity department at the overlap. The film returned 5 times its budget. That's not a studio blessing a marriage. That's a company scheduling one. And now the part that is genuinely dark. The honeymoon was a long European trip, and it went wrong almost at once. By Taylor's own later accounts and those of people close to her, Nikki Hilton drank heavily, gambled, and was violent toward her. There are reports she suffered a miscarriage as a result, and I'll flag that honestly, because it reaches us through later recollection rather than document. The timeline is not disputed. Married May 6th, filed in December, divorced in January 1951, 8 months. She was 19, divorced, and the most famous young woman in America. And the company that had paid for the wedding processed the failure as a scheduling matter. There was no pause. She was back at work almost immediately, and the apparatus that had spent the spring selling a fairy tale spent the winter selling a brave girl who had made a mistake. Nobody at MGM hated her. She was the most valuable thing they owned. It was simply an organization that could commission a gown from 15 seamstresses, coordinate a wedding and a premiere 12 days apart, and place the story in every newspaper in America. And that had no procedure whatsoever for a 19-year-old employee coming home from a honeymoon with bruises. That's not a system that failed her. That's a system working as designed, in which her well-being was never an input. So look at what an 18-year-old had been handed. Working since 9. Spine damaged at 12 and already medicated. Public statements written by strangers for a decade. Her mother directing her from behind the camera since childhood. And a marriage produced, dressed, catered, and scheduled by her employer to sell tickets to a film about a marriage. Nobody had ever asked her what she wanted, because there was no mechanism for the question. And before the marriages, one more thing from those years, because it is the first time in this entire story that she gets to decide anything. Montgomery Clift. They met on a place in the sun in 1949 when she was 17. And they were close for the rest of his life. He was homosexual in an industry that would have destroyed him for it, and she knew, and it never mattered to her once. On the night of May 12, 1956, during the making of Giant, Clift left a small gathering at her house, drove down a canyon road, and hit a telephone pole. His face was destroyed. And Elizabeth Taylor ran down that hill to the wreck ahead of everybody else, got into the car, and by the accounts of the people who were there, reached into his throat and pulled out the teeth that were choking him, and held him until help came. She was 24. Then she stood between him and the photographers who arrived, and by several accounts told them that if any of them took a picture of his face, she would make certain they never worked again. Nobody photographed him. Hold that against everything else here. A woman who had been assembled by a publicity apparatus since she was 9, who had never once been permitted to control an image of herself, used the first real power she ever had to stop a camera pointing at somebody else. That's not a rescue. That is the first moment in this account where Elizabeth Taylor decides what gets photographed. And that is where the 8 marriages come from. Not appetite, not scandal. Once you see the pattern, it is almost unbearable. Hilton at 18, sold to her by the company that employed her. Michael Wilding at 20, an English actor, 20 years older, courteous, unambitious, entirely unfrightening. They married in London in 1952 in a registry office with almost nobody there, which after the Church of the Good Shepherd tells you exactly what she was reaching for. 2 sons followed, Michael and Christopher, and the marriage failed for the reason those marriages always fail. His career declined while hers accelerated, and a man 20 years older who is being out-earned and outshone by his wife in her early 20s becomes, quite quickly, somebody she is looking after rather than somebody looking after her. It was finished by 1957. What she had wanted from Wilding was a father. That is not an insult to either of them. She had a father in the house growing up, Francis, and by every account he was a decent and largely powerless man who watched his wife and a corporation run his daughter's life and did not intervene. So she married calm, older men and expected them to hold something, and they could not, because by 22 she was bigger than any of them. Then Mike Todd at 25, and he matters more than the count suggests. Loud, vulgar, enormous, a gambler who had been bankrupt and come back, and the first person in her adult life who was neither frightened of her nor employed by anybody who was. He fought with her in public and gave her jewelry in public and treated the whole thing as a production. For about 13 months she was happy in a way she would spend the next 50 years trying to find again. On March 22, 1958, Todd's private plane, named with his usual restraint after her, crashed in New Mexico. He was killed. She was 26 and had been due to fly with him and had stayed behind with a fever. She had to be sedated. She was filming Cat on a hot tin roof at the time, a picture about a marriage in a house full of people waiting for a death. And she went back and finished it, and it brought her an Academy Award nomination. Read that again. Her husband was killed in a plane crash in the middle of production, and she returned to a set to perform Grief for a Camera, and the industry gave her a nomination for it. That is what her employer's condolence looked like, a shooting schedule that resumed. Then Eddie Fisher at 27, and this is the one people judge her hardest for, and it is the one that makes the most sense. Fisher was Todd's closest friend. He had been at the center of that marriage. When Todd died, the two people left holding the wreckage were his widow and his best friend, and they turned to each other, and it lasted about as long as that kind of thing lasts. That is grief with a face on it. America did not read it that way because Fisher was married to Debbie Reynolds, who was in the public imagination the wholesome one, and the machinery that turned on Taylor was not spontaneous. Reynolds was under contract at MGM, the same studio, and the imagery that ran in every publication in the country, Reynolds photographed with her children, hair in pins, entirely blameless, was produced by people who did that for a living. Hedda Hopper, who had been circling the Taylor family since Elizabeth was a child, printed a version of a conversation with her that Taylor insisted for decades had been twisted, and the line attributed to her about what she was supposed to do now that Mike Todd was dead followed her for the rest of her life. So the same publicity ecosystem that helped assemble her at 9 took her apart at 26, using words she said were not hers. Then Richard Burton twice, and Burton is the only equal she ever married. A Welsh miner's son with a voice like a church and a drinking problem to match, who was not remotely intimidated by her and did not want to manage her. They married in 1964, divorced in 1974, remarried in 1975, and divorced again in 1976. They made 11 films together and conducted the most public marriage of the century in front of an audience of millions. And they could not stay inside it, which is the thing worth noticing. Every man she could survive being married to was somebody she was carrying. The one man she did not have to carry was the one she could not stay married to twice. Then John Warner in 1976. And this is the marriage nobody talks about, and the one that damaged her most in public. She gave up acting for it. She went to Virginia and campaigned for him across the state, in church halls and county fairs, and she was extraordinarily good at it, and he won a seat in the United States Senate substantially because Elizabeth Taylor stood next to him. And then he went to Washington to work, and she sat in a house with nothing whatsoever to do for the first time since she was 9 years old. She gained weight, and the American press, which had spent 35 years selling her face, spent the late 70s and early 80s attacking her body with a viciousness that is genuinely hard to read now. The jokes were on television. They were in the monologues. She was, in that period, drinking heavily and taking a great deal of prescription medication, and the country found it funny. That is the marriage that put her in the Betty Ford Center in 1983, and she went public about it, which nobody of her stature had ever done. And finally, Larry Fortensky in 1991, a construction worker 20 years younger, whom she met in rehab. They married at Neverland Ranch, and the entire world laughed. But look at where she met him, in a treatment facility where neither of them had a title, a contract, or a publicist, and where the only thing anybody knew about her was that she was an addict, like everybody else in the room. At 59, that was the first time Elizabeth Taylor met a man in a place where nobody was performing. 8 marriages is not a woman who could not commit. It is a woman handed to a man at 18 by her employer, spending 40 years trying to find one she chose herself. And now the cruelest thing in this entire story. And it is not a marriage. In March 1961, during the endlessly troubled production of Cleopatra, she developed pneumonia in London. It was severe enough that at least one newspaper prepared her obituary. She underwent an emergency tracheotomy. She carried the scar for the rest of her life and refused to hide it. And for a period, it was widely reported she might not survive. The country turned back instantly. The woman who had been a homewrecker for 2 years was, within days, beloved again. And weeks later, she won the Academy Award for Butterfield 8, a film she openly loathed and had made only to complete her MGM contract. Everyone understood, including her, that the town had voted for the tracheotomy. She said so, more or less, for years. And look at the shape of the year around it. In 1959, she was the most hated woman in America. In 1960, she made a film she despised in order to be released from a contract signed for her when she was 10. In March 1961, she nearly suffocated in a London hospital. In April 1961, she walked onto a stage in Santa Monica with the tracheotomy scar visible at her throat, and collected the highest honor her profession awards. Sit with that. The single most affectionate moment America ever directed at Elizabeth Taylor came in exchange for nearly dying. That's not fame, that's weather. And understand what a lifetime of that does to a person's relationship with public opinion. She was adored at 12 for a face she was born with. She was adored at 18 for a wedding her employer paid for. She was despised at 26 for the way she grieved. She was adored again at 29 for a hole in her throat. She was despised at 48 for gaining weight. Not one of those verdicts had any relationship to anything she had actually done. A woman who works that out stops trying to satisfy the weather and starts pricing it, which is exactly what she did. When 20th Century Fox came to her about Cleopatra, she did not want to make it. So she named a number designed to be refused. $1 million. No performer had ever been paid that for a single film. It was not a negotiating position. It was a wall. Fox said yes. She was 27 years old, and she had just discovered that the ceiling she had lived under since she was 10 had never been real. It was simply a price nobody had ever tested. Understand what that did. Before it, a star was an employee on a weekly wage whose salary bore no relationship to what the film earned, precisely how MGM had held her since she was 10. After it, the top of the profession was a market. Percentages of gross, named prices, actors as principals rather than staff. The child who was studio property is the person who set the number that ended the arrangement. She asked for something absurd in order to be left alone, and somebody paid it, and the ceiling came off permanently. That's not a pay rise. That's a hostage naming her own ransom and finding out there was a buyer. And in Rome in 1962, in the middle of that production, she and Burton began the affair that became Le Scandale. The Vatican's newspaper condemned her in an open letter. There were calls in Congress to refuse her re-entry to the United States. She was denounced from pulpits. None of it worked. The film was a box office hit anyway. She and Burton became the most bankable pairing in the world. Her price went up. The difference between 1950 and 1962 was not that America had grown tolerant. It was that the studio system had died in between. There was no longer any employer who could withhold work from Elizabeth Taylor because she was no longer an employee. That is what the $1 million actually bought. Not money, immunity. And then, at the end, the thing that redeems all of it. In 1985, when AIDS was a disease public figures did not say out loud, Elizabeth Taylor put her name to it. She helped found AmFAR that year and created her own foundation in 1991. She testified before Congress. She raised money in rooms where people were angry she was raising it. Be clear what 1985 was. A disease the president had barely mentioned. Funeral homes refusing bodies, hospitals rationing care, a great many Americans treating it as a deserved verdict. Her friend, Rock Hudson, whose entire career had been an act of concealment enforced by exactly the machinery she grew up inside, announced his diagnosis that summer and died in October. She organized a benefit before he died, and by her own account was hung up on repeatedly by people she had known for 30 years. Stars did not come. Sponsors did not want the association. She did it anyway, and kept doing it for 25 years. Now put that beside the schoolhouse on the MGM lot. She had been raised inside a system whose central product was concealment. Of illness, of sexuality, of addiction, of anything that interfered with the picture. And she had watched what the concealing cost the people around her. That's not celebrity charity. That's a woman spending the second half of her life dismantling, in public, the exact apparatus that built her. And there is one more piece to it that is easy to miss. The single most useful thing she owned by 1985 was not money. It was the ability to make a photograph happen. Point her at a hospital ward, and there were cameras. Point her at a congressional committee, and there were cameras. Stand her next to a dying man, and the picture ran everywhere. That capacity had been built on top of her without her consent, starting at 9, by men who wanted to sell tickets. She was the only person alive who could aim it. And she aimed it at people the country had decided not to look at. So look at the eyelashes again. A double row where a single row should be. A mutation cataloged in medical literature as a condition, present on a baby in a Hampstead nursery in February 1932, months before anyone on Earth had plans for her. For 90 years, those eyes have been the shorthand for the whole story. The luckiest girl who ever lived. The violet eyes. The face that launched 1,000 magazine covers and 1,000 more that were less kind. It is always told as a gift. But follow what that face actually cost. It got a 9-year-old appraised by men who discussed her the way you discuss livestock. It got a 10-year-old signed to a contract she was too young to sign. It got a 12-year-old onto a horse she fell off, into 59 years of pain and 40 years of medication. It got an 18-year-old married in a dress bought by a corporation to sell a film about a wedding to a man who hurt her. It got a 26-year-old back onto a soundstage weeks after her husband was killed. It got a 29-year-old the most love America ever gave her, in exchange for a tracheotomy. It got a 48-year-old mocked on national television for the size of her body by the same industry that had spent 35 years selling it. She did not choose any of it. It was a condition she was born with, and an industry built a 100-year business on top of it before she was old enough to object, and then she took it back. She named a number that was meant to end the conversation, and it broke the system instead. She converted the fame into assets she held in her own hands, and the money into a foundation for people the country had decided not to look at. MGM got the girl. The country got the face. The dress went into the ledger as a promotional expense, alongside the prints and the posters and the cost of the premiere. And the only thing in this entire story that was ever hers to decide was what she did with it afterward.